The night that shocked Moscow. On a bitterly cold night, December 5, 1992, two men in a dusty black sedan parked quietly outside a modest office building in central Moscow. The building, bearing the nameplate of a seemingly ordinary company called MMM, looked deserted. There were no guards, no surveillance, just an eerie silence as snow drifted through the dim streetlights. The men stepped out, their breath-forming clouds in the freezing air, grabbed two large duffel bags, and cautiously approached the building's entrance. Moments later, a loud crash echoed through the block as they forced the doors open. What they saw next paralyzed them with awe, rooms overflowing with cash. Rubles piled up to the ceiling, stacked in crude towers that threatened to topple over. Loose bills littered the floor like autumn leaves. What began as a simple robbery turned into an unbelievable stroke of fortune. Realizing their bags couldn't carry even a fraction of the treasure inside, one robber rushed outside and drove the car up to the entrance. Within 15 frantic minutes, they loaded every inch of the vehicle with bundles of banknotes before vanishing into the cold Moscow night. Little did they know they had just scratched the surface of what would become the greatest financial scandal in Russian history. A wake-up call for a billionaire. Not long after, security guards arrived and discovered the breach. Glass shards scattered across the entrance, papers strewn about, and most alarmingly, massive voids where mountains of cash once stood. They immediately contacted the company's founder, Sergei Mavrodi. Half asleep in his luxurious Moscow apartment, Mavrodi answered the call and listened to their anxious report. But instead of panicking, he reacted with indifference. "Don't wake me for nonsense like this," he said coldly before hanging up. For him, the loss was insignificant. Mere pocket change in his vast financial empire. Why? Because this was just one of many such offices filled with stacks of cash. In fact, estimates later revealed that MMM had stored nearly a third of Russia's national budget in various locations, cash lying around like old newspapers. This strange indifference revealed something profound about Mavrodi's operation. Money had become almost worthless to him. What mattered was the flow, the system, the game he was playing with an entire nation's wealth. While ordinary Russians scraped together their life savings to invest in his scheme, he casually dismissed the theft of millions as a minor inconvenience. The man behind the madness. To understand this insane accumulation of wealth, we must rewind the clock. Sergei Mavrodi wasn't a born criminal, he was a mathematician with a sharp intellect and a sharper sense of how to exploit people's beliefs. Born to a humble family in Moscow in 1955, he was a brilliant student who graduated with honors from the Moscow State Institute of Electronics and Mathematics. In Soviet Russia, his talents could have led him to prestigious research positions, but Mavrodi had different ambitions. He had observed how systems worked, how people behaved, and how trust could be manipulated. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was drowning in economic uncertainty, Mavrodi found a golden opportunity amidst the chaos. With his brother Vyacheslav and business partner Olga Melnikova, he established a company named MMM, a name derived from their initials. Behind his thick glasses and unassuming demeanor lay the mind of a master manipulator who would soon bring a nation to its knees. Russia's economic collapse. To grasp why MMM succeeded, one must understand the desperate landscape of early 1990s Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it left behind a traumatized population and a shattered economy. Hyperinflation ravaged savings overnight. What was worth a car one day could barely buy bread the next. State industries crumbled. Jobs vanished. Pensions became worthless. Elderly people who had worked their entire lives for the state suddenly found themselves begging on streets. Doctors and professors became taxi drivers and street vendors just to survive. The psychological impact was devastating. Generations raised to believe in state security were suddenly cast adrift in a wild capitalist experiment. This wasn't just economic turmoil, it was existential panic. And into this void stepped men like Mavrodi, offering what seemed like salvation. As one victim later recalled, "We didn't invest in MMM. We invested in hope. It was the only hope we had left." This desperate environment wasn't just conducive to fraud, it practically demanded it. From tech business to financial empire. Initially, MMM imported computer equipment and office furniture, capitalizing on the nation's growing need for electronics and business infrastructure. Business boomed in the early days. Import restrictions had been lifted, and Russians were hungry for Western technology. But Sergei wasn't satisfied with mere success, he wanted power. Recognizing the desperation among ordinary Russians for financial stability, Mavrodi pivoted dramatically. In February 1994, he re-registered MMM as a joint stock company and began selling shares to the public, offering dreamlike returns of 1,000% annually. It was the perfect setup for a pyramid scheme in a country where most citizens had no concept of investment risk or financial literacy. Investors poured in, convinced they were participating in a future tech empire. Offices opened in Moscow first, then spread like wildfire to other cities. Within months, MMM had established over 100 branches across Russia. Money flowed in faster than it could be counted. What made it worse, his marketing genius turned what should have been obvious fraud into a national movement. Brainwashing the masses. Mavrodi launched an aggressive PR campaign like nothing Russia had seen before. His masterstroke was creating a fictional everyman character named Lyonya Golubkov who appeared in a series of television commercials. In these ads, Lyonya, a simple worker, becomes wealthy overnight by investing in MMM shares. The catchphrase, "I'm not a freeloader, I'm a partner," became a national sensation. TV ads, newspaper columns, radio jingles, and colorful billboards flooded the country. Ordinary citizens watched elderly pensioners and construction workers alike claiming overnight riches just by buying MMM shares. The company's distinctive rainbow-colored logo became as recognizable as any national symbol. For many, it seemed like a miracle. Trust grew. Faith solidified. He even paid for free metro rides across Moscow just to boost public image. In a masterstroke of manipulation, Mavrodi created his own currency, biltov, or tickets that seemed to constantly increase in value. People stopped questioning and started believing. Russia wasn't just experiencing a financial fraud, it was witnessing mass hypnosis. The mechanics of madness. So how did MMM work? Investors would buy shares, essentially worthless colored papers with no backing, at low prices. Twice weekly, Mavrodi would arbitrarily announce new share prices, always higher than before. The value of these shares would rise artificially over days and weeks, often multiplying 100x in no time. In truth, earlier investors were being paid with money from newer ones, a classic Ponzi scheme hidden behind glossy marketing. What made Mavrodi's version unique was his transparency about it. He openly admitted there was no real business activity generating returns. When questioned about sustainability, he simply replied, "As long as people believe in MMM, it will work." MMM offices sprouted up in every major Russian city. By mid-1994, an estimated 10 to 15 million Russians had invested in the scheme. At its peak, MMM was taking in about $50 million daily. Sergei Mavrodi became a national icon. His face was everywhere, and for millions, he was the messiah who'd save them from poverty. The human toll. Behind the astronomical numbers were real human stories, both triumphant and tragic. There were the early investors who did indeed become wealthy. One Moscow taxi driver invested his entire savings of 1,000 rubles in January 1994 and cashed out 1 million in June, enough to buy an apartment. These success stories fueled the frenzy. But there were darker tales too. Families sold everything they owned, apartments, heirlooms, even wedding rings, to invest in MMM. Elderly pensioners invested their life savings. In Perm, a retired teacher stood in line for 3 days to invest money she had saved for 40 years. As the scheme grew, so did the crowds. MMM offices became scenes of near-religious fervor. People camped overnight, singing songs about Mavrodi and sharing stories of future wealth. One investor described it as part investment office, part church. When asked why they trusted MMM despite warnings, a common response emerged: "The government has always lied to us. At least Mavrodi is honest about lying." Challenging the Kremlin. At the peak of his influence, Mavrodi took an audacious step that revealed his true ambitions. On New Year's Eve, he purchased national television airtime and addressed the nation, replacing the traditional presidential message. Sitting behind a desk like a head of state, he promised Russians prosperity in the coming year through MMM. The move sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. The idea that a civilian, a former mathematician, was now acting like Russia's ruler triggered government alarm bells. President Yeltsin reportedly flew into a rage upon learning that millions of Russians had watched Mavrodi instead of him on the most important holiday of the year. Authorities cracked down, arresting Mavrodi on charges of tax evasion in August 1994. But this only sparked mass protests. Thousands of citizens marched in the streets of Moscow, demanding his release. They carried signs reading "Free Sergei" and "MMM is our hope." They believed he was their only hope for financial salvation and that the government was persecuting him out of jealousy. From jail to parliament. Even from behind bars, Mavrodi remained a master manipulator. He announced his candidacy for the State Duma, Russian parliament. From his prison cell, as media frenzy exploded, he promised that his freedom would restore payments to investors and protect their interests against government interference. In an unprecedented move, the authorities released him just 10 days later. To shield himself from further legal threats, he successfully ran for parliament in October 1994, winning a by-election with 29% of the vote. This victory granted him parliamentary immunity from prosecution. Almost immediately, he restarted the scheme, selling new shares at rock-bottom prices and claiming they'd soon skyrocket. MMM2 was born. But this time, the magic didn't work. The government had frozen MMM's accounts. Public trust, though still strong among core believers, had eroded among the broader population. The pyramid had grown too large to sustain itself. The collapse and consequences. As weeks passed and payments failed to resume, trust eroded completely. Investors realized they had been fooled. The bubble burst spectacularly. Over 15 million people had been scammed out of an estimated $1.5 billion. The human impact was devastating. Suicides were reported across Russia. In Saratov, a father of 3 jumped from his balcony after losing his family's savings. In Siberia, an entire village had pooled their money to invest in MMM. After the collapse, they couldn't afford to buy seeds for the planting season. Families were ruined. Marriages collapsed under financial strain. A new term entered the Russian lexicon: MMM widows, people who had lost everything to Mavrodi's scheme. The broader economic impact was significant too. Some economists estimate that MMM's collapse delayed Russia's post-Soviet economic recovery by years. In October 1995, the State Duma stripped Mavrodi of his parliamentary immunity. A new criminal case was filed and he was placed on an international wanted list. But by then he had vanished. The man who disappeared. For years, no one could find him. Rumors spread he had fled to Greece or Scandinavia or was living under a new identity in the United States. Russian authorities searched extensively, certain he had escaped with billions. But in reality, the mastermind had never even left Moscow. He lived in a rented apartment next door to his own house, hiding in plain sight while plotting his next move. For over 5 years, one of Russia's most wanted men lived quietly in the capital, occasionally venturing out in disguise. During this period, he wrote science fiction novels and developed new financial schemes. He maintained contact with a small circle of loyal followers who still believed in him. According to later testimonies, he lived modestly, caring little for luxury despite having access to millions. His obsession wasn't wealth but the game itself. The mathematical elegance of creating financial systems that exploited human psychology. In 2003, a newspaper expose finally revealed his location. Police raided the apartment and found Mavrodi living alone, surrounded by books and computers. When arrested, he reportedly said, "Took you long enough." Global scammer and final fall. During his hidden years, Mavrodi hadn't been idle. He had expanded online, creating new pyramid schemes targeting Americans and Canadians through internet platforms. Using offshore accounts and digital currencies before they became mainstream, he scammed over 300,000 people internationally. His new venture, Stock Generation, operated from the Caribbean but targeted Western investors, promising returns that made MMM look conservative. The SEC eventually shut it down, calling it a prime example of how the internet can be used to quickly disseminate a fraud worldwide. Eventually, a tip-off led police to his Moscow hideout, and what they found was staggering: secret premises packed to the roof with cash and financial documents. Authorities seized 18 truckloads of money and evidence. The man who had once controlled a third of Russia's cash flow was finally behind bars. Mavrodi was imprisoned once more, but this time for a substantial sentence. At his trial, he showed no remorse, arguing that his investors were willing participants who understood the risks. He maintained that MMM was not a crime but a financial game with transparent rules. The court disagreed, sentencing him to 4.5 years for fraud. The Phoenix tries to rise. After serving his sentence, Mavrodi was released in May 2007. At 62, he emerged from prison to a very different Russia. The wild capitalism of the 1990s had been replaced by Putin's more controlled economy. But Mavrodi remained unchanged in his ambitions. Still obsessed with his old game, he tried reviving MMM in other countries where financial regulations were lax and economic desperation high. He launched MMM India, MMM China, and most successfully, MMM Africa, targeting countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. His new ventures operated primarily online, using social media and digital payment systems. In a bizarre twist of adaptation, he incorporated Bitcoin into his schemes years before mainstream adoption. None of his new ventures matched his original empire, but they caused significant damage nonetheless. In South Africa alone, an estimated 130,000 people lost money to his scheme. In his final years, Mavrodi became an almost mythological figure, part criminal, part folk hero. He gave occasional interviews where he decried the global financial system as the biggest pyramid scheme of all. He published manifestos calling for financial revolution and claimed he was working on a new system that would liberate humanity from monetary slavery. Legacy of deception. In March 2018, Sergei Mavrodi collapsed at a bus stop in Moscow and died of a heart attack at age 62. He left behind no fortune. Reports indicated he had less than $100 in his bank account. But his legacy extends far beyond money. The MMM saga permanently altered Russia's financial landscape. It created deep distrust in financial institutions that persists today. It spawned dozens of copycat schemes. It entered the language. In Russia, financial pyramid and MMM are synonymous. Mavrodi's techniques, using social proof, testimonials, and creating a sense of community among victims, became a blueprint for scammers worldwide. His innovations in marketing fraud have been studied by both law enforcement and, unfortunately, by new generations of swindlers. Perhaps most disturbing is his enduring popularity. Years after his death, online communities still praise him as a financial revolutionary who exposed the contradictions of capitalism. MMM memorabilia, shares, posters, even action figures sell as collectibles online. Sergei Mavrodi's story is a chilling reminder of how charisma, marketing, and manipulation can dismantle a nation's financial trust. His empire wasn't built on economics, but on the collective dreams of millions who simply wanted a better life and paid the ultimate price for believing in it. The greatest pyramid scheme in history didn't end with Mavrodi's death. Its lessons about human psychology, desperation, and hope continue to echo through financial markets and society at large. In an era of cryptocurrency bubbles and online investment schemes, Mavrodi's ghost still haunts us, warning of the thin line between financial innovation and fraud. As one former MMM victim put it, Mavrodi didn't invent human greed or desperation. He just perfected the art of exploiting it. In that exploitation lies a cautionary tale for us all.